The threat China poses is real, and it could be imminent. We hope not, but it certainly could be. But beyond our borders and beyond our neighborhood, we are reorienting toward deterring aggression by communist China. Those who long for peace must prepare for war. And that's exactly what we're doing. Nobody knows what China will ultimately do, but they are preparing. And therefore, we must be ready as well.
The U.S. Secretary of Defense gave an extremely hawkish speech in which he repeatedly referred to China as a threat, and he said in no uncertain terms that the U.S. military is preparing for war. I'm not exaggerating. Listen to this clip here of the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth say that the U.S. is preparing for war, although in typical Orwellian fashion, he claims that the U.S. must prepare for war in order to achieve peace.
The motto of my first platoon, first one I led, was those who long for peace must prepare for war. And that's exactly what we're doing. We are preparing for war in order to deter war, to achieve peace through strength.
So essentially, war is peace is the message of the Trump administration's Pentagon. This has been a slogan that has been constantly repeated by Pete Hegseth. He says that Trump wants peace through strength. And he says that the U.S. empire wants to reestablish deterrence. And in this speech, Hegseth repeatedly said that Donald Trump will not hesitate to use military force if the U.S. considers it necessary.
President Trump said it himself last month in Riyadh and will never hesitate to wield American power swiftly and decisively if necessary. That is reestablishing deterrence.
And he said if deterrence fails, then he is preparing for war.
But if deterrence fails, and if called upon by my commander-in-chief, we are prepared to do what the Department of Defense does best, to fight and win decisively.
And Pete Hegseth gave this speech on the 31st of May at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is a conference that is held every year in Singapore. This brings together leaders of countries from the Asia-Pacific region. Now, the United States is in the Western Hemisphere, very far away from Asia, and the U.S. is the leader of NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. However, the U.S. claims to be a Pacific power, largely because the U.S. state of Hawaii is located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, but also because the U.S. has militarized many countries in the Asia-Pacific region, including South Korea and Japan, that have been militarily occupied by the U.S. for over 70 years. In fact, the U.S. Defense Secretary joked about this in his speech. He noted that in just 4 months after the Trump administration entered office, he had already visited the Asia-Pacific region 2 different times, although he refers to it as the Indo-Pacific region, which is part of an attempt by the U.S. government to rebrand the Asia-Pacific to add in India as part of the U.S. strategy to try to ally with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and India against China. But anyway, Pete Hegseth boasted that he's going to keep coming back to this region to threaten China. And he said clearly that the U.S. is here to stay in this region on the other side of the world.
As was mentioned, I'm certainly proud to be back in the Indo-Pacific for the second time as the Secretary of Defense. And I'm going to keep coming back and back and back again. You're stuck with me. But it's not just me. America is proud to be back in the Indo-Pacific, and we're here to stay.
That was how Pete Hegseth began this very hawkish speech. And essentially the message was, in a nutshell, the U.S. is preparing for war on China, and the U.S. empire insists on maintaining its hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region. The U.S. empire wants to control this entire region, and he repeatedly referred to China as a threat. And he told China, you are not going to kick the U.S. empire out of this region.
A threat gathers. It requires confronting obvious truth about the threats that we face in the Indo-Pacific, and it requires meeting those threats with a very real sense of urgency. Let me begin by saying we do not seek conflict with Communist China, but we will not be pushed out of this critical region.
Now, for people who don't know, Pete Hegseth has very extreme political views, and he is an aggressive China hawk. He was formerly a host on Fox News, the right-wing TV channel, and Trump used to watch him all the time on TV and said he should run the U.S. military. And Pete Hegseth published a book in 2020 that outlined his extreme fundamentalist religious views. The book is called American Crusade, and in it, he proudly refers to himself as a crusader. He says that the U.S. empire should continue the Christian crusades that were launched 1,000 years ago. And on the first page of the book, he said that the right wing in the United States, which he proudly identifies with, is waging a holy war. He used the term holy war. And who are the targets of this holy war? He made it very clear that in the book, he said those targets are China, and he always refers to China as communist China with this kind of Cold War rhetoric. So he says communist China, the international left, and Islam. Billions of Muslims around the world. Those are the main targets of this holy war led by the guy who's now overseeing the Pentagon, the U.S. Department of Defense. The U.S. Defense Secretary claimed that supposedly China seeks hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region, which, by the way, is false. The Chinese government has constantly said it does not want hegemony. But essentially, what Pete Hegseth was trying to do is he was warning other countries in the Asia-Pacific region who were attending the Shangri-La Dialogue, this conference. He was telling them that the U.S. empire wants to ally with other countries in Asia against China. And he claimed that supposedly China was bullying other countries in the region and threatening to use military force. He didn't mention that China has not fought a war since 1979, but Hegseth claimed that China is his big threat and the U.S. is going to protect Asia. And of course, its real goal is to maintain U.S. hegemony in the region.
China seeks to become a hegemonic power in Asia, no doubt. It hopes to dominate and control too many parts of this vibrant and vital region. Through its massive military buildup and growing willingness to use military force to achieve its goals, including gray zone tactics and hybrid warfare, China has demonstrated that it wants to fundamentally alter the region's status quo. We cannot look away, and we cannot ignore it. China's behavior toward its neighbors and the world is a wake-up call, and an urgent one.
Now, this is all completely false and absurd. If you know anything about China's foreign policy, you will know that China has constantly emphasized over decades that it does not seek hegemony, and in fact, it doesn't want any country to have hegemony. This has been a slogan going back to Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, and today under China's president Xi Jinping. All of these leaders have emphasized that China is against colonialism, imperialism, and hegemony, or as they say in Chinese, hegemonism. This is constantly reiterated by Chinese diplomats. They use the Chinese term bachuan, which means hegemony, and they say they do not want hegemony. In fact, when the People's Republic of China normalized diplomatic relations with the United States and Japan in the 1970s, one of the causes of diplomatic conflict was that China insisted that in the joint statement signed by China and the US, and also in the joint statement signed by China and Japan, there had to be something known as the anti-hegemony clause. And Japan did not want to sign this. Of course, Japan was an imperial power that committed horrific crimes in the Asia-Pacific region, including in China. Japan colonized China and killed tens of millions of Chinese. So China has always insisted on imposing hegemony and imperialism. That is at the heart of the foreign policy of the People's Republic of China. Even some mainstream American scholars have admitted that China is not seeking hegemony. For instance, Foreign Policy magazine is one of the most elite establishment media outlets in the US, and they published an article by Stephen Walt, who is a professor of international relations at Harvard University, the elite Ivy League university. And he admitted that China does not want hegemony. And what this is really about is an attempt by the US empire to maintain its hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region. So the US is actually accusing China of what Washington wants. Washington is afraid of the fact that its hegemony is weakening. So the US is trying to pressure other countries in Asia, trying to force them to join the US in its new Cold War on China to weaken China to try to maintain US hegemony. And in fact, in this speech that the US Defense Secretary delivered at the Shangri-La Dialogue conference in Singapore, Pete Hegseth essentially told countries in the region that they should minimize their economic relations with China. They should not trade too much with China. He was essentially telling these countries that they have to choose between either the US or China, that they can't have good relations with both sides because a war could be coming soon. And if these countries are economically integrated with China, it would make it difficult for the US military to wage war. As he put it, it would complicate our defense decision space. Listen here.
Facing these threats, we know that many countries are tempted by the idea of seeking both economic cooperation with China and defense cooperation with the United States. Now, that is a geographic necessity for many. But beware the leverage that the CCP seeks with that entanglement. Economic dependence on China only deepens their malign influence and complicates our defense decision space during times of tension.
Now, a big part of the speech delivered by Pete Hegseth was focused on Taiwan. For decades, the US government has supported separatist forces in Taiwan, even though the US technically recognizes that Taiwan is part of China. When the US government normalized relations with the People's Republic of China in the 1970s, the US signed a series of diplomatic agreements known as the Three Communiques, in which the US agreed to the One China principle, or the One China policy, in which the US recognized that there's only one China in the world, and Taiwan is part of China. This is written into international law. The United Nations considers Taiwan a province of China, and even US-dominated institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, where the US is the only country with veto power. The IMF is based in Washington, D.C. And yet, if you go to the IMF website, it says very clearly, Taiwan, province of China. But in this speech delivered by the US Defense Secretary, he fearmongered about Taiwan. He said communist China wants to invade Taiwan. And he said that this would be a threat to the Asia-Pacific region and the world.
Every day, you see it. China's military harasses Taiwan. It has to be clear to all that Beijing is credibly preparing to potentially use military force to alter the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. Again, to be clear, any attempt by communist China to conquer Taiwan by force would result in devastating consequences for the Indo-Pacific and the world. There's no reason to sugarcoat it.
By the way, Pete Hegseth is known for having this very strange tendency where he's constantly referring to US soldiers as warfighters. You know, he's a hardline neoconservative war hawk, and throughout this speech and other speeches, he constantly boasted about how the US military is all about lethality, and it's the most lethal fighting force in the world, full of warfighters.
So we're focused on lethality, meritocracy, accountability, standards, readiness, and warfighting. We are revitalizing our defense industrial bases and reallocating resources toward the most lethal and effective capabilities. We're doing this because success of the warfighters requires it, to see an integrated defense industrial base supporting those forces and standing ready to keep them in the fight. We announced that we're upgrading U.S. Forces Japan headquarters. This is about warfighting and deterrence.
And he also boasted that Donald Trump is boosting the U.S. military budget to more than $1 trillion to prepare for war.
Our second priority is rebuilding the military. We're equipping American warfighters with the most advanced capabilities so that we remain the strongest and most lethal fighting force in the world. President Trump is spending, for the first time ever, over $1 trillion next year to do this, a 13% increase in American defense spending.
So what the Pentagon was trying to do in this speech is tell countries in Asia that the US military will work with them against China to deter so-called aggression by China. Although, again, China has not been involved in a war since 1979. The US is at war every single year, constantly, including in Asia, and yet we're supposed to believe that China is a threat. And anyway, Pete Hegseth is telling these countries, join the US, join us against China.
We will stand with you and work alongside you to deter Chinese aggression. Each day, together, creating more and more dilemmas and complications should China want to act.
However, I have to say that this US strategy is not going very well. You know, the US is trying to force countries in the Asia-Pacific region to pick a side, either the US or China. But most countries are actually maintaining good relations with both sides. A good example of this was in May, there was a meeting held between the members of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and also China, Japan, and South Korea. And they released a joint statement saying that they're going to deepen their cooperation, especially economically. And this came after another meeting was held in March between China, Japan, and South Korea, in which they talked about ways to promote and deepen economic ties and even talked about signing a free trade agreement. And in this meeting, and also in the meeting with ASEAN, one of the biggest issues discussed was the threat of tariffs by the US government. Trump has threatened to impose high tariffs not only on China, but also on many countries in ASEAN like Vietnam, and even on longtime US allies like Japan and South Korea. And this has angered many countries in the region, which is why instead of joining the US in this new Cold War, they've been maintaining a non-aligned foreign policy with good relations with both sides. And it also helps that China is the largest trading partner of ASEAN and Japan and South Korea. So they're not going to sacrifice their own economic interests on behalf of the United States, although that's what Washington wants. And by the way, all of these countries are already part of a trade bloc called the RCEP or RCEP, which stands for Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. The US is not part of RCEP. So the US is trying to force all of these countries to go against their own economic interests to benefit the US empire at their expense. And obviously, even longtime US allies like Japan and South Korea are not going to voluntarily do that. And another example of this increasing non-aligned foreign policy in the region is a historic summit that was held in Malaysia on the 27th of May that brought together ASEAN, the Gulf countries, the Persian Gulf countries in the GCC, and China. This was the first ever ASEAN-GCC-China summit, and it didn't get much attention in the Western media, but I think this was historic, and it's a clear symbol of the increasingly multipolar world that we're living in. So it's obvious that the US attempt to force countries in the Asia-Pacific region to join its new Cold War against China is completely failing. But in the speech that Pete Hegseth gave, he boasted about the growing partnership that the US has with India.
For example, look no further than to our growing defense relationship with India, where we pass new milestones by the day, from shared ventures of our defense industries to the increased operational coordination and interoperability between our two militaries.
However, I have to say that even in the case of India, the situation is not as clear as the US government would like the world to think. So yeah, India and the US do have good relations, but recently the Indian government has been trying to improve its relations with China. Clearly, China-India relations are very complicated, but before the BRICS summit that was held in Russia in 2024, China and India made an important breakthrough in their diplomatic relations. And relations were getting better until the conflict between India and Pakistan. And by the way, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that US politicians and war hawks in Washington have been encouraging more conflict between India and Pakistan because China and Pakistan are close allies. So the US wants to worsen relations between China and India by fueling more conflict between India and Pakistan. But again, despite that, the situation is not as clear-cut as Washington would like the world to think. And India also very much has a non-aligned foreign policy. India has good relations with the US. It also has very good relations with Russia. And its relations with China have been improving. So even there, Pete Hegseth is exaggerating the impact of this US strategy of divide and conquer. However, there is one country that is essentially volunteering to be the Ukraine of the Asia-Pacific region that is allowing the US empire to use it as a battering ram against China, and that's the Philippines. The Philippines is currently governed by Ferdinand Marcos Jr., known as Bongbong Marcos. He's the son of the brutal military dictator of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who was a very corrupt right-wing leader. His family stole billions of dollars of wealth from the Philippines. But the reason that he was able to maintain an iron grip on power as this brutal dictator for so many years is because during the first Cold War, the US empire strongly supported him. And today, in the second Cold War, in Cold War II against China, the US is using Bongbong Marcos in the Philippines as an outpost to try to weaken China. The US is using at least 9 military bases in the Philippines that were voluntarily given over. Control over them was given over by Bongbong Marcos, this corrupt oligarch. And the US has deployed a missile system to the northern part of the Philippines known as the Typhoon missile system, which has a range of nearly 2,000 kilometers and can hit most of the cities in mainland China. And this is obviously a clear threat to China. And when Pete Hegseth, when the Pentagon talks about the first island chain.
So first, the Defense Department is prioritizing forward-postured, combat-credible forces in the Western Pacific to deter by denial along the first and second island chains.
They're talking about the chain of islands going from the East China Sea and Okinawa down south past Taiwan, past the Philippines into the South China Sea, and ending down in Southeast Asia. And the US has been militarizing the first island chain, trying to force these authorities in the region, these governments, to allow the US military to put missile systems in their territory. And the only government that has been willing to do this is the Philippines. And they're essentially making themselves a major target if there is a US-China war. But the other governments in the region have not been as stupid, frankly, as the leadership of the Philippines, which is run by corrupt right-wing US puppets. And these other governments are saying, no, we do not want to be blown up in a US-China war. So again, this US strategy of divide and conquer to try to force the other parts of the Asia-Pacific region to unite with the US against China, that strategy is failing. The vast majority of governments in the region are not going along with Washington's new Cold War. It's basically just the Philippines and Australia. So these two colonial outposts. By the way, the US empire colonized the Philippines in 1898 after the Spanish-American War. The US empire took over former Spanish colonies, including Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. And also, Australia was created as a British settler colony. It was actually originally a penal colony where the British Empire sent its prisoners, and then Australia later got independence. But so we see that these two colonial outposts are really the only countries that have gone full in the new Cold War, supporting the US, allowing the US empire to use them as forward operating bases for war on China. But the other governments in the region do not want to be the new Ukraine. So just like how the US pushed Ukraine into a proxy war with Russia, fighting into the last Ukrainian, now the US is preparing to fight to the last Filipino or to the last Australian. But it's very clear that the US government is waging a new Cold War, and Washington is trying to blackmail and pressure countries all around the world to join it in this new Cold War against China. And not only in the Asia-Pacific region, but in the speech, Pete Hegseth also threatened Panama. And he said that the US is trying to reimpose its hegemony on the Western Hemisphere. This is a reference to the colonial Monroe Doctrine. And he said that the U.S. empire is going to take control over the Panama Canal, which is colonialism, blatant 21st century neocolonialism.
We're also increasing security in the Western Hemisphere and taking back the Panama Canal from malign Chinese influence. It is key terrain, after all. China did not build that canal. We did. And we will not allow China to weaponize it or control it. Deterrence starts in our own backyard. But beyond our borders and beyond our neighborhood, we are reorienting toward deterring aggression by communist China.
Now, before I wrap up here, I want to emphasize two very important points. The first is that this new Cold War that the U.S. is waging against China is bipartisan. It's not just Republicans who are pushing for war on China, but also Democrats. Now, the Republicans in the Trump administration are more blatant about it and more explicit, using bombastic, very aggressive rhetoric, but their policies are quite similar to those of the Democrats who came before them, and especially the Joe Biden administration. And this was actually admitted openly by Eli Ratner, who was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs under Biden. So he was a top Pentagon official in the Biden administration. And of course, he's a China hawk. And on Twitter, he said very clearly that despite all of the very aggressive, bombastic rhetoric in Pete Hegseth's speech, he said that there was, quote, near total continuity with the previous administration, end quote. So this is a top former Biden official saying that there was near total continuity in the Biden Pentagon's China policy and in the Trump Pentagon's China policy. And he said this is a good thing. This war hawk in Washington considers this to be a good thing. He said, quote, that's good, but we'll need heightened urgency, attention, and resources to address the China challenge, end quote. So that's really the main difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. The rhetoric of the Republicans is more explicit and aggressive and openly colonial, and they say China is a threat. Whereas the Democrats, they talk about the rules-based international order and human rights and democracy, but they basically have the exact same policy, which is an imperialist policy, a neo-colonial policy, trying to maximize the power of the U.S. empire, trying to impose U.S. hegemony on the world. And instead of calling China a threat, they call China a challenge. But it's really a superficial difference. Now, the other point that I want to make before I conclude is about the Orwellian rhetoric of the U.S. government. You know, the U.S. empire has been at war for hundreds of years nonstop. It's constantly waging war around the world. And yet it says, we want peace. We only have to wage war in order to defend peace. It's this Orwellian idea that war is peace. And this is so clear in the rhetoric of Trump's Pentagon. Pete Hegseth constantly says that they want peace through deterrence. And he claims that they don't want war with China, but they have to prepare for war with China because supposedly it's China that wants war, even though China has not fought a war since 1979. And in the speech that Pete Hegseth gave, he claimed that the Trump administration doesn't want war and they're not trying to encircle and contain China.
The United States, especially under President Trump, does not seek war. We do not seek to dominate or strangle China, to encircle or provoke.
Now, this is completely false. It's a lie. How do we know this? Because Donald Trump's Treasury Secretary, the billionaire hedge fund manager Scott Bessent, admitted that the U.S. government has a grand encirclement plan to try to contain China. Bloomberg reported on this in April. It noted that Scott Bessent said that the U.S. is trying to pressure Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and India to come together to, quote, approach China as a group, end quote, in what was described as a, quote, grand encirclement strategy, end quote. So this is by definition an attempt to encircle China. And once again, this imperialist strategy is bipartisan. It's not just the Trump administration. If you go back and look at an important speech that was given by Biden's neoconservative Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, in 2022, he admitted that the U.S. is pursuing a containment strategy against China. As he said, Washington is trying to, quote, shape the strategic environment around Beijing, end quote. That's just a fancy way of saying Cold War style containment.
But we cannot rely on Beijing to change its trajectory. So we will shape the strategic environment around Beijing to advance our vision for an open, inclusive international system.
Every empire in history has always claimed to be acting in self-defense. Every aggressive, warmongering country, when it starts a war, claims that it had to wage the war out of self-defense. And the US empire is doing exactly the same today, claiming we don't want war with China, but we just have to prepare for war with China in order to maintain US hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region, where the US is not located. The US is in the Atlantic region. That's why it's the leader of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But the goal of the US empire is to not only maintain hegemony in the Asia-Pacific, but in the entire world. And that's why the US is so desperate to try to weaken and contain and encircle China. That's the goal of the new Cold War, to isolate, weaken, and eventually overthrow the Communist Party of China so the US empire can do to China what it did to Russia, to the former Soviet Union in the 1990s. Privatize all of China's assets, sell them off to Western companies, privatize all of China's state-owned enterprises, install obedient puppets in China like Boris Yeltsin in Russia, who will do whatever the US wants, and ultimately, the US empire would like to territorially break up China, carve off parts of China like Taiwan and Tibet and Hong Kong. That's the goal of the US empire, and that's why, as the Pentagon admits, it is preparing for war with China. If you want to learn more about the US military's preparations for war with China and how Silicon Valley big tech corporations are profiting from this, in the description below, I will link to a report and another video that I did looking at more evidence showing how dangerous Washington's new Cold War drive is. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. If you like the work that we do here, please consider supporting us. We are completely independent. We have no institutional support. Our work relies entirely on small donations from viewers and listeners like you. So if you want to help to sustain our work, you can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com/support. I want to thank everyone again. I will see you all next time.